Thank you everyone for joining the Junior Library Guild today for our YA Fantasy webcast. We're really excited to have you here. If you have any questions for us, please feel free to just pop that in the chat and hopefully we'll get to them. Thank you to everyone who submitted questions beforehand. There was a lot of awesome questions, so we tried to incorporate that into the PowerPoint. All right, get ready to learn more about our New York Times bestselling author, Amelie Wen Zhao, her love for fantasy, and why she writes for her YA audience. We'll dive deep into some Chinese mythology, different elements in her book, and some world-building techniques that she uses when she's writing her stories. Sit back, relax, and get ready to have some fun. Before we begin, I'm going to hand my metaphorical mic over to Hannah so she can go over a few housekeeping items.
Hello, everyone. I wanted to let you all know this webcast is being recorded. So if you know somebody who can't be here or you can't stay the entire hour, we have you covered. Anyone who registered will receive a follow-up email with a link to the on-demand recording. It'll also be available next week on our website at juniorlibraryguild.com and our YouTube channel. So please feel free to share the recording with fellow librarians, teachers, friends, and readers. And if you are new to Zoom and want to change your screen view, you can do so on the top right. We recommend side-by-side view because we will be sharing pictures and visuals along the way. You can also hover over the boundary between the shared screen and the speaker's video to adjust the size of each view. We are so happy that you all are here, and thank you all for submitting your wonderful questions when registering. We're going to ask as many questions as we can today, but let's get started. I'm going to pass it back over to Rebecca.
Thanks, Hannah. So first, we're going to kind of jump into some interjections. First, we have New York Times bestselling author of Song of the Last Kingdom duology, Amelie Wen Zhao. Amelie is also the author of the Blood Heir trilogy and writes these fantasy collections while working a full-time job. I'm really not sure when she gets to sleep. But thank you so much for working with our team and for joining us today, and for writing for YA readers.
Thank you guys for having me, and hello everyone. So good to have you guys here. I'm so excited for the Junior Library webcast and to talk all things young adult fantasy and mythology and history. So thank you guys.
And then joining us from the JLG editorial team is Maria Zhang Hamelin, who is an associate editor for our YA and adult crossover books. She reads for all JLG fantasy categories, our current trends high, and adult crossover thrillers. Maria helped select the best books for your JLG book boxes, including the Song of the Last Kingdom duology.
Hi, everyone. Just jumping in here to say hello. And Hillary, you are right, because Amelie looks freaking gorgeous today. So thanks for calling that out in the chat.
Thanks, Maria. We also have Hannah McCarthy from the JLG marketing team. She's our automation manager. Hannah is just a Zoom and a tech wizard. She does all the behind the scenes for us. We couldn't have these webcasts would not be possible without her, nor the numerous other things she does for our team. So thank you, Hannah, and thank you for always having answers to my crazy questions, even when they're last minute. Oh,
I keep pressing that button. It's not wanting to unmute. Thank you so much. Hello, everyone.
And lastly, my name's Rebecca Cybulski. I work on the JLG marketing team as our copywriter. And the best part of my job is getting to connect, with our JLG authors and illustrators, even some of our editors who have gone on to select books at different publishers we work with. But this is the best part of my job, and I'm really grateful that everyone was able to take time out of their day and join us. So first off, I'd love to learn more about you, Amelie. Could you tell us about your background, why fantasy, and then kind of why you write for the audience you choose to write for?
Yeah, definitely. I love this question to start with. So I grew up in Beijing. I was born in Paris and I now live in New York. So a true definition of Chinese diaspora. Um, and I just grew up consuming tales of fantasy from all over the world, starting with Chinese fantasy in Beijing, where I grew up. I remember we would go to my grandma's like courtyard house, and she had so many like fantasy books sitting there on like our myths and our legends. And my mom would read them to me, my grandma would tell them to me. So that was my first dose of fantasy. It always felt like living in an old or historical house. It felt kind of like the magic was just entrenched in there for me. And then when I got to around grade school, I started to learn English. And so the first books that I picked up, I knew not one word, but the first book I picked up was one with a little boy on a flying like bird-ish hippogriff. And later on, I realized that I started reading Harry Potter from the third book. So that's how I learned English, and that drew me and exposed me into the world of Western fantasy. And then just growing up, I always found kind of respite and just magic and adventure in reading and in fantasy books. And so coming to the US for college as a young adult or younger adult, I really wanted to see the stories that I grew up with on the shelves. I feel like young adult fantasy, especially in literature, is just so full of like hope. It's full of like empathy, and there's so many different perspectives that we can learn just by entering the pages of a book. So that's really what drew me to writing young adult fantasy and young adult fiction, and wanting to bring in a whole new perspective from this whole other corner of the world to my readers.
I have to ask, do you have a favorite Harry Potter book?
Oh my gosh. I think like the first one I read, which was the third book, probably imprinted on me. So I might say that one. It was kind of where I feel like the series connected and expanded into the rest of the, I don't even know what you call a 7-book series, just heptology. But but I think I would say that one because I just remember the hippogriff so clearly.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing. All right, I'm going to pass the mic over to Maria for these next few questions.
Amelie, I loved hearing about your childhood in Beijing and kind of like you were talking about the home that was like entrenched in magic and how your love for fantasy kind of started there. And actually, I kind of have like a similar story with my grandparents. So I spent the first 4 years of my life in Beijing, in China, with my maternal grandparents. And I hung out with my grandpa like all the time. Like he was my mom, he was my dad, he's my everything. So he and I would do this thing where we would go to the bookstore downstairs, and then we would get like they had these hot dogs and croissants, and then we would like sit on the curb and like eat the hot dog and croissants and then go into the bookstore and kind of like, we could do that like a couple of times throughout the day. And that was kind of one of our favorite pastimes.
I think I know what hot dogs and croissants are. Is it like in like a hot
Yeah,
dog?
yeah, 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 yeah,
I
yeah,
think
yeah,
I know what
yeah.
you're
Yeah.
talking
Oh my
about.
God. And I haven't found hot dogs like that in America. It's just like it tastes different. It's different. So yeah, I wanted to rewind a little bit back in time and get to know little Amelie just a little better. I know you already touched on this. We talked about your background, how you were born in Paris and you grew up in Beijing. You went to uni in the States and you've stayed here since then. And as a fellow Chinese diaspora, who I am today and the perspective I bring, the stories I'm drawn to, definitely has so much to do with growing up between countries and cultures. So you already touched on this, but if you wanted to expand on like how has your experience growing up, a little bit all over the place, shaped your work.
Yeah, for sure. I think like the diaspora identity never really leaves us at all. It's something that, we grapple with for, at least I have for most of my life. Am I at first it was like, am I too Chinese to, read English or Western books? Because I definitely didn't understand a lot of the cultural context of like Harry Potter and other literature. And now it's, am I becoming too Western for Chinese culture? So it's kind of always feeling like a tug of war for me. And I feel like that's something that my characters will always kind of grapple with is their roots. Song of the Last Kingdom is heavily inspired by wuxia and xianxia, which are, we'll talk about it later, but it's kind of like the fantasy genres that are foundational to a lot of Chinese literature. At the same time, though, I would say they're more Chinese diaspora versions of those because they deal with colonization, they deal with conquest, they deal with, internal imperialism. And that's something that I at least haven't seen yet across the literature I've read from my home country. So it feels kind of like a meeting in the middle where I'm writing for people of all sorts of backgrounds coming from this shared experience and this identity that makes us so similar, but also so vastly different in our backgrounds. And so with Song of the Last Kingdom, it was so heavily inspired by my own grandparents' history. I think I've told this story, but when I used to go to my grandma's courtyard house or the Siheyuar, I would see like her clothes packed in these little bundles of cloths everywhere around. And then we would make fun of her. We would be like, why do you do this? It's so messy. And then she would tell us, or one day I found out, she didn't tell us, my mom did. I found out that it's because when she was small, she had to flee a lot of wars. She had to run away from like Japanese invasion first and then internal political turmoil and natural disasters. So she had to pack all her belongings in a little cloth bag and just up and go like that. And so that made me realize just how, alive the histories of our past and our ancestors really are in us. So that drove a lot of the history and the examination and the period and setting of turmoil and war that the Song of the Last Kingdom is rooted in. And then when the characters, they start off having this identity that's cut off from a lot of the traditions that their previous ancestors and bloodlines have had. And that's kind of reminiscent of the experience I feel like we go through as diaspora is figuring out our real identities. For me, it's figuring out, all the different ethnic minorities that my family comes from and that, we might not practice their traditions anymore, but it's important to know and to honor that. So a lot of influences and in my writing from my Chinese diaspora background.
I love how you shared the story about your observation of your grandma's bundles of clothes. Actually, I feel like I had a similar experience. When I was a kid, I would kind of like, I don't know, make fun of my grandma. Or like when you're a kid, you make observations about adults and you have no idea where that behavior comes from, why they do what they do. You're just kind of like, oh, that's kind of funny. My grandma, she used to like I don't want to say hoard things, but she would, when she gets things, she likes to like hide it away in all of these like cabinets and cupboards around her home. And to the point where she started hiding things and she would like forget where she stashed the goods. And at first I was like, why does she do that? But, it comes from having grown up in a period of like, through the Cultural Revolution. And like, she was also, she met my grandpa when they were soldiers and
Yeah.
wars, and it was a tumultuous time for sure. And to feel like, that insecurity, there's so much movement around you, things that you can't control, you just get swept up into it. And the only thing that you can do is kind of like hold on to the things that you have. So I understood that as I got older. And I wanted to also talk a little bit about how you shared on the canons, and like when you were older you were thinking about like, this is Western canon, this is Eastern Chinese canon. And I have a funny story about that, which is that when I was young, I was obsessed with Sailor Moon, but the Sailor Moon that I watched was Chinese dubbed. So I've only ever known Sailor Moon in the context of like Mandarin Chinese. And
Oh
I thought that Sailor Moon was canon to like Chinese mythology. And I think, like, after I gotten older, I was like, oh my gosh, this is actually Japanese. I didn't know that. And so I think that kind of made me feel like it's interesting to be exposed to different things from different worlds, different cultures when you're young, and to kind of just like accept that as like, this is canon. All of this could be my canon. And I think that it kind of helps for kids to be exposed to different things when they're younger, just so that they can have more appreciation and feel like it's easier for them to read all kinds of books and feel like they can see themselves in those books. Um, so I know Rebecca has a poll question for the audience. I'm going to let her jump on here.
Yes. So everyone who's in the audience, we're going to have 4 different poll questions for you today. So if you go ahead and answer those, we'll talk about your answers after this next slide here. Thanks, Maria.
Right. So before deep diving into Some the Last Kingdom, I wanted to talk about a current trend in the young adult space that Amelie's tapped into here. And that is the genre of wuxia or xianxia specifically. And I don't know if our viewers who are tuning in here have noticed that this Chinese fantasy subgenre has totally blown up in the Western scene in the past few years, and it's everywhere now. Every major streaming platform like Netflix or Hulu is kind of hosting these TV series that are produced in mainland China with the biggest acting darlings. So there's 2 parts to my next question. The first is, how would you, Amelie, describe Xianxia to those who are unfamiliar with the genre?
I love this question, and we have to be careful not to let this go into like an hour-long spiel of like Xianxia C dramas because that's like my love. But for those who haven't heard of it, Xianxia is essentially what I would call the high fantasy of Chinese literature and Chinese canon. It draws on all the gods and demons and spirits and mythological beings and beasts, and it imagines a world where there are different realms and in existence, a lot of times with the gods and immortals in the skies or the humans on the earth, or there are like, demons, etc., in the underworld. The term itself comes from, it's made up of 2 Chinese characters, xian, which is immortals and gods, and then xia, which means legendary warrior. So it's a lot of like, kind of sword fighting and these mortals who become entangled in the mythological and the gods and the demons of the underworld, and it's just such a fascinating space to explore in fantasy.
I actually went through a little bit of a Chinese period drama binge throughout the pandemic. I mean, it's truly escapism at its finest. And
Yes.
most xianxias, they showcase a lot of gorgeous sets and costume designs and foods. And I also found a lot of comfort in the more leisurely paced storytelling as opposed to the fast pacing of most US series. Um, but yeah, as with every genre, there are certain tropes and touchstones that kind of help define the story and its characters. Amelie, I'm curious as to if there were any tropes common to Xianxia that you wanted to give a nod to in Song of the Last Kingdom, or any tropes that you wanted to avoid and why.
I love this question. And then for those who don't know, wuxia is like kind of I guess I would compare it to Westerns of like Western literature, where it's just like these heroes sword fighting, less so with gods and demons and all, but still some involvement. There are so many tropes, and I think that Xinxia Wuxia in Chinese literature they have such different forms of storytelling from the West. and some of which I love to be able to draw on and play with and try to kind of introduce and kind of meld into a form that I think is still acceptable and can be easily ingestible by a Western or global audience or non-Chinese audience. So I think one trope that I was like really beloved to me, maybe it's because it imprinted on me as a kid, but it's the fact that nothing ever comes easily. So I don't know if Maria, you've heard of like stories where, for example, the disciple wants to register or enroll at a martial arts temple or wants to become the disciple of a master. And they can't just, knock on the door and be like, oh yeah, here's my registration form. I'd love to sign up. No, one story I remember, I can't remember which myth it's from at the moment, but the disciple had to was rejected by the master at first, and they had to kneel in front of the temple for like maybe it was like weeks or months, which I don't think that's physically possible, but this is fantasy, so that's okay. And the master was so moved by his integrity that he said, you know what? You've been here, you've proven yourself and your dedication. I'm going to accept you. And that was the first test. And so that just stuck with me as a kid because I was like, oh my God, like I would starve to death, but maybe it'll be worth it if I get into this practicing temple. So if you've read Song of the Last Kingdom, one of the first things that you come upon when you try to enter the School of the White Pines is 999 steps. You have to climb all of them all the way up. And that's one of the Easter eggs that like allude to this kind of tradition where nothing comes easy and you have to earn it all. So that's one of the things I really wanted to put in there and make it fun. As to the tropes, I think I wanted to more so avoid or kind of branch off on was the exploration of the female identity in some Xianxia wuxia. I think in recent years, the genre has progressed so much, and we have all these, Xianxia romance that are very much female-led. But even so, a couple that I've watched, they tend to make the female character very reliant on the male. Sometimes they're softer or less powerful, or just like they plain just don't know what they're doing and they have no power. So I really wanted to avoid this and to really imbue power into each of the females that I crafted. They can be unpleasant sometimes, like Dilaya and her mother Ulara don't come across as nice at first, but they have power and they have their own goals and motivations. And of course, with Lan, I think the defining lines that I wrote for her were she would no longer be the flower, she would become the blade. And so she's can be a soft girly, she's fun, but she also, wants and has a lot of power and her own motivations in the story.
I love how you talked about that sort of stereotyping in more traditional sort of Chinese dramas and things like that, where yeah, a lot of the times the female main character can be someone who upholds, I guess, those sorts of cultural values. Like you look a certain way and you're like this long suffering all sacrificing woman who's like, yeah, take me instead. And then you're just like, and it's a little much, but nowadays, I try my best to enjoy it from that cultural lens. But I also want to say that in your books, I think you did a fantastic job of having a female protagonist that people here can identify with. But not only that, you talk about Dilara and that whole clan and how I think you did a really good job with showing how expressing love in Chinese culture is different. And it's equivalent to like expressing care or like nagging. And it's not so like, oh my God, I love you so much. Like that just doesn't happen. And like, this is, everyone says this, but like, when your mom cuts you a plate of fruits and she puts it in front of you, that's true love. And it's true. And I try to keep that in mind also when I'm reviewing different books from other cultures. So moving on to The next slide, yes. So I think at this point, you've probably piqued a lot of our viewers' interest in this genre. And to help them along their own Xianxia binging journey, could you share some of your favorite dramas and or Chinese mythologies with us and how they made it to your greatest of all time list?
Yeah, so favorite Xianxia dramas. I have so many, but the two that I picked are first Ashes of Love or Xiangmi Chen Chen, 静如霜, which is by two of my favorite idol actors that might have something to do with it. It's a Xianxia romance, which I really, really love to watch. And it features a girl who goes from, she's not so powerful at first, but then she becomes, super powerful and has her own motivations and ends up having to save the kingdom. And then the other one is Xianxia by one of my favorite Chinese authors. It's called Lost You Forever, and it just became a drama that came out in 2023. I'm obsessed with these books and this drama, and there's another trope in this that I love that's a romance trope of 暗恋 or hidden love in Chinese meme tropes or storytelling, where you can love someone so deeply but you never say it, as you just said, Maria. And there's one of the male leads who is in this situation, and you can so see that he loves the female protagonist so deeply, but he never says it once throughout this. And that was just the ultimate, like, ugh, for me. So love this book, or the series, love the TV show, and super recommend.
If these visuals don't just give you the biggest romantasy vibes, I don't know what would. But yeah, it's totally the guy who just doesn't say that he's totally in love, but then every time there's any sort of like they're looking at each other deeply or they're about to kiss, the camera pans like from 8 different angles and it like plays in slow-mo like a thousand.
Slow-mo.
Yeah, but it's like I love that. I love that. And I think, yep.
All right. I kind of wanted to talk about this yin and yang energy throughout your book and kind of how they work together. And when there's an imbalance of one, something doesn't go right. So I'd love to hear more about, the resources you use to look into this, or maybe your own personal outlook on life and how these themes kind of developed in your books.
Yeah, I love this question. And the entirety of the Song of the Last Kingdom, from like title to concept to characters to their arcs and journey, and so much thematically is about balance, which is signified by the opposing forces that the two characters, Lan and Zen, represent. And they're kind of like yin and yang, even in color. Lan, she has the silver dragon. It's like white, pale, whereas Zen, he has the black tortoise, it's like darkness, etc. But I think the real theme of this is drawn from really this phrase that my dad taught me since I was a very little kid. In Chinese, it's called 中庸, or the balance of the mean, I think it's called. And I actually put one of the quotes, one of the chapter headings has the definition of this, which is that, sticking to the middle, the center, and keeping balance is always better than two extremes. And that's a principle that I follow in life in general, in anything. I don't believe in being too extreme. I believe in harmony and balance. And I think these themes definitely reflect, for example, in the magic systems of the, I guess, two different races in Song of the Last Kingdom. You have the Atlanteans, who have perfected and industrialized their cold metal magic, and they really are going for ultimate power and complete control. Whereas the Hin use their magic as sort of, they want it to be in harmony with nature. It's the 5 elements, and they really, really believe in the power of balance. I think that's a key theme throughout. In terms of the, I guess, the thematic exploration as well as to how much power and, is power good or bad? There's one extreme where Lan thinks we can't have any power is dangerous. We can be cut, symbolized by her pushing away the demon gods, which represent ultimate power. Then you have Zen and his clan who believe in completely being able to have power and being able to use it. And the answer, at least I hope to explore throughout the book, is that you need both. It's a yin yang. And if you've seen the symbol of yin yang, there's a little white circle in the dark part, and there's a little black circle in the white part. And that symbolizes that there is always a bit of the other in each.
Have there ever been times in your life where you've kind of felt like your balance has been off before? And what did you kind of do to get yourself back on that track?
Oh, that's a good question. I guess in terms of work-life balance, that's something I constantly struggle with. And I guess I haven't really adhered to that there, because my life is, I work at a bank, for the audience that don't know. And then I also am writing books, and that leaves me very little slivers of time for personal life and everything. So that's something I'm seeking the answer to as well, and trying to find more of a harmony or a mean in between.
I think everyone could use practice with that for sure, with the work-life balance. So
Yeah.
we're right there with you. All right. So we're actually going to go ahead and launch the second poll question. So everyone should be able to answer that. And I did want to go over the first poll question really quick. So the first poll question was about the art of practicing. And so we asked, what would be your art? 36% of our viewers said song. 31% of our viewers said spirits. 19% of our viewers said swords. 13% medicine. Oh, and we had one viewer say demonic.
We need to find out who that is. I love that. I was trying to vote, but I think we can't vote for the poll. But song and spirits are probably my top choices as well. Not sure I would be good with swords.
I think spirits would be mine. I definitely have some friends who would be medicine. All right, and so that second question should be up for everyone to answer, and we'll kind of go over those answers a little later. So next we're going to kind of dive into how you build your own world in the fantasy genre. I know we had a lot of questions from our viewers on this. So could you kind of talk about, the challenges in building your own world, what you enjoyed about it? Maybe if there's times where you felt like you didn't know where to go next in your writing, kind of how you overcame that?
Yeah, I love this question because I love worlds and magical worlds, especially in books. And I think that the way to build a world is going to be very similar in getting it across to your audience, no matter what you're writing, because you need to slowly be able to draw the reader in. I think what fantasy writers have to grapple with that maybe contemporary or real world writers don't is different building blocks of essentially made up things. And that's the approach that I took with my world building. Even though most of the concepts I use they're not made up. They're literally drawn from Chinese myths and Chinese culture, but to audiences around the world, they might not have come across this. Just like when I was in China reading Western literature, I hadn't come across a lot of the aspects or the concepts. So being able to do foundational building blocks to kind of first set the base and be able to have the audience understand, okay, there's this thing called qi, which is the spiritual force that runs through everything in the world. Then you have the next level, the practitioners or the magic users that are able to wield this and turn it into magic. And then the offshoots of the different branches of tea, whether you can use a fire and a water and combine it, or an earth and an air to make yourself, propel yourself to fly. So like things like that, going from foundational to L2, L3, and then on, I think is the challenge. I think that's what every fantasy writer, whether you're whichever culture you're writing in, faces. For me, getting through the history was also a big challenge because it's not a secret, but Song of the Last Kingdom, the history is essentially a very, very condensed version that mirrors the true history of China. And so I had to keep all the events on the page. Like I have a whole other document that has the history as well as the mythology and philosophy of that world. And I had to pick out really the strands that were relevant to the story for this story, because there's so much that you could write, like one single character in one dynasty could just fill a whole page, but I had to condense it and really keep clean the threads that I wanted to introduce in order to tell the story and to highlight the themes. So I think that was my biggest challenge. And with my editor too, at one point she was like, this book is reaching the physical limits of how long a young adult book can be. And I was like, okay, you're right. We have to simplify. We have to make it much more straightforward for the reader. So yeah, I think that was my main consideration when building the world and making the history and myths.
When you're thinking about your characters, did you have a favorite character to write? Did any of your characters kind of progress in ways you didn't think they were going to? And then whose arc managed to surprise you?
I think most of these questions can be answered with one character, which is actually Dulaya. So she started off as like, you have the stereotypical like antagonistic girl to the main female protagonist. So she starts out as that, and she has really good reason to, have prejudices against demonic practicing, against Zen and his clan, and then against Lan, whom they know has some sort of demonic practicing skills. So she has good reason. She was maimed at a young age because of this magic. Her clan fought against this magic historically. And so she really comes in really just hating them and hating that. But I think one of my favorite scenes in the ending of Song of Silver Flame Like Night, I don't think this is a spoiler. I hope most of you have read the first book, but it's when Ulara, Delia's mom, who essentially taught her daughter, we have to hate demonic practicing and all of this prejudice. She chose to actually sacrifice herself for Lan and for her daughter. Throughout the most of the book, we see her be really, really harsh to her daughter and to Lan. But as Maria and I were discussing, like the different forms of love in different cultures, some maybe Chinese parents tend towards more of this tough love where like we will never say, I love you. I still never really say that to like my friends or family, honestly. But I think that's her way of showing it, the ultimate sacrifice, Ulara, and admitting to Lan, that I was wrong. And this is what I'm going to do. You guys have to carry on the legacy and take on my heritage, because that's a huge theme of the book, is taking on the heritage and the legacies that those of the past have given over to us. So I think it's Delia and her mom, Ulara, actually.
I know I had a soft spot for her in the book. There's obviously parts where I don't necessarily love her, but I almost want her to be more lovable. And just her history, I think, really makes her who she is.
Yeah.
Do you want to tell us a little bit about how this map came to be?
Yeah, I have my little version sitting here where I first drew this. So we have to, for fantasy worlds, we usually have maps, and then the publisher can hire an illustrator or an actual map artist to make it for us. So this is a much, much better version than the one that I drew, which is here. I don't know if people can see it, but it's a very rough approximation of some of it mirrors China, of course, like the Shu basin lens is kind of another, like an allusion to Sichuan. And then Hakgong, of course, is a mirror of Hong Kong, where my husband's from. So a lot of these I drew inspiration from the real world, but most of it is made up. So the map maker took my shoddy little map and then made it into something completely beautiful with the 4 demon gods in the corners, and then like really, really beautiful art.
I love that you still have the original version.
I just want to say how impressed I am that not only are you a best-selling author, you're also like a freelance cartographer. Um,
I'm definitely not. Like I struggle with like directions. I will say this here, no one repeat it, but in my first book, I flipped east and west on my map, and then my editor was like, "Why are there Eastern Isles in the west?" And I was like, "The world is round." It just depicted on the other side. But
like
we
not
ended up
in my
having to
world, not in my
not in my- but that's very kind. Thank you.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit more about your writing process. And I don't want to sound too much of a simp when I say this, but um, while I was reading Song of the Last Kingdom, I really felt like I was being brought back to my childhood, growing up around all of my favorite Chinese mythology adaptations like Madam Whitesnake, which I religiously watched with my grandpa back in the day. And I think it's a real testament to your skill, how you were able to strike such a nostalgic chord for me, and just how masterfully you were able to balance traditional Xianxia elements with a story that's not only written in English, but also has such a wide reader appeal. So I'm wondering if you had any creative challenges with working out all of these elements that you had to juggle.
Yeah, it's so interesting because the act of translation isn't just linguistic, it's also cultural, that I found at least. So for me, it was honestly just, for someone who's from like experience or from two or multiple cultures, it's how do I blend them and how do I draw upon different types of storytelling techniques to try to translate it for a completely different cultural audience or background. And I think one of the things that I found interesting, I guess I'll say two. So first, a lot of readers have asked me this. They're like, where did you come up with like the swear words in it? Because I've never heard these, like, rat fart, like rabbit whelp, turtle egg. And I was like, those are actual swear words in Chinese. Like we like turtle egg is wang ba dan, which we actually, excuse my language, but we actually say that. So I thought it'd be like hilarious to just translate them, and they sound so funny on the page in English, but it was like a little Easter egg for, people who understand or people who have some sort of Chinese foundational background. So that was one thing that was fun, not necessarily a struggle, but just an artistic choice I decided to make. The other one is more on a conceptual and storytelling basis. How romance comes across the page. I think in at least Chinese and most East Asian cultures, it's very, very subtle and held back. And the best example I have of this are dating shows. I don't know if there are people who watch The Bachelor here or Singles Inferno, which is a Korean dating show. It's not Chinese, but I found I like really identified with how they expressed romance. In the like I watched one the beginning of The Bachelor once, and I was just shocked because within the first, like, as soon as the bachelor meets the bachelorette, they kiss. And I was like, what is happening? Like, how can this be? Like, what are you going to lead up to? Because with the Eastern dating shows, it's more like so polite, and you build up for 8 episodes for them just to touch hands. And that's like the most of it. So it was so fun for me to explore romance in a Chinese storytelling way, or Chinese cultural way here. And there are two side characters, Shanjun and Chou Tai, who are in love and are in a romance, but it's very, very subtle. And I had some readers come to me and they said, are they together? And I was just like, yeah, like, yeah, in my mind, and I hope I put it on the page, but they are in love and they're together, but just a very like subtle hidden love kind of way.
They're like a hands-off kind of love. But to me on the page, I was like, oh yeah, I feel it. I feel it. They're like this, just like this deep kind of stable sort of very zen.
Oh.
And so yeah, now you were talking about how you had to work on linguistics with the storytelling. So now we get to have a little bit of fun with language and how you use a variety of it in A Song of the Last Kingdom to make the storytelling that much more immersive and historically enriching. So a little bit on pinyin. It's a system that spells Chinese words with the Latin alphabet based on their pronunciation. So pin means to puzzle out or spell out, and yin means sound. So together, pinyin pretty much literally translates to spelling out or figuring out the sound of. And it helps people like me to read Chinese. And lots of kiddos start out with pinyin accompanying Chinese characters in picture books and board books to help them learn and eventually memorize each character. So here you get a wonderful example of how I struggle bus to keep in touch with my mother. And on the left is an example of how I spell out Chinese characters with these Latin letters. And I often continuously spell it out so that the autofill function can kind of help me and help guide me towards picking the right characters. And on the right, you'll kind of see how my mother texts back, which is by actually drawing out the characters on the iPhone screen because she got it like that and she's 1,000 times more fluent than I am. So these are not actual screenshots of our text. These are stock photos that I got from the internet. But in the next slide, Amelie, I noticed that in your writing, sometimes you would provide direct translations of certain words, such as choosing to use the phrase schoolhouse, which is a direct translation of 书房, instead of using, like, I guess, a commonly used Western term like library. And sometimes you would provide the pinyin, such as 父王, instead of actually translating it into like Father King. And sometimes you would provide both the translation and the transcription of a word in the text. I'm just wondering, how did you decide which versions of the words that you wanted to use?
I love this. I'm such a geek when it comes to this. And like, I have so many facts about like how pinyin just revolutionized the Chinese economy and connected it to the Western world back in the like 50s or 60s, which is why it was invented. But I think when it comes to translation and transcription, I think this is definitely more of an artistic choice. And part of my goal was to make song very Chinese and very just like you can be feel steeped in the world. And a part of that, and a part of a lot of fantasy books, is to introduce terms that just immerse you into the world. And so I chose to do that with not made up, but actual Chinese terms, but just by transcribing them directly as pinyin. I think for me, the kind of soft rule I took was that for like very magical objects and repeated more objects, right? I chose to put the pinyin of those words. And whereas with locations, I chose to directly translate them to give a more atmospheric effect, like School of the White Pines, Where the Rivers Flow in the Sky's End. Like, it sounds so interesting because usually English, you don't have such long names, but it's actually how, we would name things in Chinese. So I think that was a deliberate artistic choice. And there's no like right or wrong. The foundation is getting across the meaning to the readers, which is why in most cases for the pinyin terms, both are going to be included because I needed to give a definition in English. But it's something I'm experimenting with in like my next books, which are also Chinese fantasy, but I take a kind of very different approach to this. So I think it's a deliberate artistic choice, more so than a scientific one.
It's very cool. And I love that something about it is more like trusting your gut too. And there's like intuition there, like mulling the words in your mouth to see like what sits right with the text. I think so much of language works in just like mysterious ways. And I so enjoyed how much I was able to learn about historical Chinese garb and like architecture just because you worked it into your amazing world building in such an organic way. So thank you for that. Uh, and now I believe we get to enjoy some of your delicious fan art if you want to talk about that.
Yeah, so I actually worked with Chinese artists. These were part of the pre-order and promotional images that I sourced from literally just artists in China. So it was so fun to check out the different styles. And I settled on one. Mr. Zhang Zhuo has been with me for the duology. And I just love his artwork and how the brushstrokes look like ink almost. So that's the style that I definitely wanted to bring to Song of the Last Kingdom to kind of honor just traditional Chinese art. So this was just so beautiful, and I'm so blessed to work with Mr. Zhang Zhuo. And then I think on the next slide, Li Wen is also one of the artists that I chose to give a more like concise and modern esque interpretation of the characters.
Be honest, do you have any of these as your screensaver right now?
I actually don't. My
Oh my
screensaver,
God.
what is it? I don't even, my phone is right here, but I like looked, my screensaver is my family in Shanghai, but I definitely love these so much. And I have them saved in my photos for sure.
Gorgeous.
All right. We're going to go ahead and launch that third poll question so that everyone can go ahead and answer. And let's see. So for our second poll question, we asked, which of the song characters would you like to spend a day with? Oh, okay. So actually, the top three choices are pretty close percentage-wise. Around 25% of people said Lan, Zen, and Dahlia. And then 6% said Tai, and 12% said, and Amelie, you could probably pronounce this much better than myself. Shanjun.
Yeah, oh my God. Okay, I feel like Shanjin should, like, I wouldn't want to spend my day with Delia. She's just so rude, to be honest. Or Tai, he's so rude. But I'm glad that readers love them and that people would want to hang out with them.
I think my answer would be Lan, for sure.
Yeah, she's so fun.
And then that third question, what song location would you want to visit on your vacation? We still have some answers rolling in. So maybe we can talk about the answer when we're done with this slide. We'd love to hear more about, your travels in China and how it influenced your duology. Maybe if there's any certain cities, historical landmarks, or just experiences that kind of influenced your writing.
I also love that the poll question was about locations, which was just perfect for this slide. So thank you guys for that. But I go back to China like twice a year, after the pandemic, once it opened up. But so much of song, if not all of it, was inspired by just my experiences growing up there and, visiting. One little gem that I put in there, looking at the map, is that the School of the White Pines is located in a mountain called Yuelushan. And that actually is where one of my ancestors was a master of one of the four Chinese book houses, or four Chinese educational, I'm not sure what they're called, but 四大书院, like the four Chinese educational centers in the past. So it's in Hunan, where my dad's from, and we've climbed up the mountains, and there's a little rock with my ancestor's name on it. And so I was like, I have to set my school here secretly and put in like the history there. So I remember climbing that mountain as a child, and it was so hot during the summers, and I was like, why do we have to be here? I just want to be playing Neopets, on my computer. But looking back, they're just such fond memories that I just are so precious to me. Another huge inspiration was actually Lan's courtyard house, which is definitely based off of my grandma's courtyard house. And so we literally spent every weekend there growing up, sitting beneath her giant jujube tree and like chasing the cats and like collecting little worms from the ground that would fall from the trees because we had no internet over there. So putting Lan's home there and putting that as like one of the ultimate symbols of something she wants to protect from the colonizers and from, the internal erasure of her culture and her people was so important. And not really a spoiler, but going back to see it in the second book of the duology was just one of my favorite chapters in the book.
Would you like to talk about this photo?
Yeah, this was just like a very fairy-esque grove that we found, I think it was last March when we went to the Jiangnan, like southern-ish region. So this was in Suzhou in China, which is so well known for all the waters and trees and birds, and it's just so beautiful there. And I'm working this into hopefully one of my forthcoming books. But it felt like such a fairy grove.
It looks like a fairy grove. Yes.
Right?
Like very calming, very peaceful.
Right.
And then where was this photo taken at?
I think this is also in Suzhou. The exact place is called something like the Provincial Administrator's Courtyard or something. I can't remember quite, but it's beautiful there. And I was like, I need to get some photos for sure.
And then Hannah, do you want to go ahead and pull up that last poll question for us, and we could see what location people wanted to visit in the book? All right, for whatever reason, I can't see the poll question, so we'll come back to that at the very end. Maria, did you want to?
Yeah, sure. So this is my second to last question for you, Amelie. I wondered if any family or friends and their musings have inspired any of the setting, characters, or plot in Song of the Last Kingdom. And how do you think your story would be received by your family in China? I know you talked a little bit about how your relatives might not be fluent in English. So are there any plans for Song to be available in Chinese?
Oh my gosh, that would be honestly such a lifelong dream if we were able to get it to a Chinese publisher and have it in Chinese. Only my dad can read and speak English in my family, and my sister, of course. But a lot of the research and consultation was from my dad, who is descended from the master of one of the four Chinese book houses. So maybe there's something there. But one of the best examples is I was trying to read the travel log of this famous Ming Dynasty geographer called Xianxia, and it's written in like an ancient-ish Chinese text, Wenming Wen, which I really like. I can read most of the characters, but I don't understand what it's saying. So I had to like, there were some mornings when I would get up early or I would sleep later and I would Skype my dad and be like, can you just like take me through these paragraphs and help me understand? So that was really, really fun. And some of it definitely influenced some of the locational descriptions and settings in my research.
That's so cool and so fortuitous that you had such a close connection.
Yeah.
You can just draw upon, and he's like, looking in the archives, or he can, read
Right.
like Wen Ming Wen, which is like, I don't think I know anyone who can not in my life. Rebecca, did you want to take over with the poll question answering?
Yes, yeah. So for the question, what song location would you want to visit on your vacation? 45% of people said they'd like to go to the School of the White Pines. 31% said Lawns Courtyard House. And then, okay, the last two options are split both at 12%. So maybe you could help me with the pronunciation, Amelie, but Shakalahara.
Xianxia and Gong. Yeah. Both of which are inspired by real places, Gong, Hong Kong, and then Xianxia by the Crescent Lake City. But yes, I figured with like a whole, like this is the junior library webcast, and with librarians, we'd all want to go visit the School of the White Pines. So I am very pleased and not surprised at all.
We're going to go ahead and launch that last poll question. And we can talk about it after this slide.
So as I understand it, Amelie, I believe you wrote the first book in this duology, Song of Silver, Flame Like Night, when the pandemic first started. And I'm wondering, how did that timing influence this story? And what would you like for teen readers to take away from this reading experience?
I love this question, and it's kind of like the end at the beginning of how this all started. I'm sure every like writer has their pandemic story, but for me, it was a perfect confluence of factors that you can really see across Song of the Last Kingdom. It was a time when China had closed off to any flights from across the world, so I wasn't able to go back and see my family for almost 5 years during that. So it was a time of homesickness. And of course, as a writer, I was like, well, if I can't physically go back, then I'm just going to hallucinate it and put magic into it. So writing it was so just incredibly fulfilling and a way to like combat my homesickness during the pandemic. It was also inspired by a time when there was a lot of anti-Asian sentiment from something that is not our fault at all, and was fueled by a lot of bigotry. And I remember there was an incident where there was a shooting with a parlor of mostly East Asian women, and then seeing that was just super heartbreaking and shocking. And I just remember looking at all these, a lot of them were immigrants. There was one particular Chinese immigrant whose identity and name I found out, and her family was in China as well. And so that really struck a chord in me. And I just remember like sitting down at that point, and I wrote the words, "She would no longer be the flower, she would become the blade." And I just wanted to write a story of, an incredibly empowered Chinese or East Asian female protagonist fighting against colonialism. So that's kind of the confluence of how Song came to be and the story itself, which of course gained traction with like themes of yin yang and things of power and history. History that's actually very much present in the day-to-day and the modern day reality of a lot of people around the world. So it is very much a COVID story, and you can completely see the fingerprints of that throughout. But I think what I would love to have teen readers take away from this is I think all young adult stories, at least the ones that I write, end on a note of hope. And there's the theme of legacy and heritage. And with song, I think with all books, right, you're entering completely a different person's mind and perspective, and being able to read from a different person's or culture, from a different background, is so important for us to become more empathetic and sympathetic as people. So I think having sympathy for people from different backgrounds and having the hope to make things better is always the message that I want to leave with my teen readers.
That was so beautifully said, as Bridget calls out in the comments. But as you were talking about your homesickness, I was really struck that maybe Song of the Last Kingdom is kind of like your love letter to your family too. You
It
know,
is.
I haven't seen
Yeah.
them, and you're just compiling like an anthology of like love letters. And then two books came out of it. And I totally what you talked about during the pandemic, what it was like to be an Asian American in America during that time. It's, you know, it's left its fingerprints and impacts on everyone. And even now, my brother, even though he's in New York and he works in finance, like you, but he, on his phone, he gets news alerts for the Bay Area, so that anytime there's anything, he like texts it to my family group chat, because he wants to know that like my parents are safe. My parents aren't, you know, going to randomly come across any danger just because of who they are. So I think Rebecca wants to take it away with the poll question.
Yeah, I don't know how I'm gonna follow that. Thank you both for sharing your stories and experiences. Um, Amelia, I really like how you said, you know, having different stories where we can be more empathetic and learn about different people, different cultures, different ways of life. I think it's really meaningful and important, especially for, you know, our audience of librarians. So thank you for talking about that. Our last poll question, it asked, which of the 4 demon gods would you choose to partner with? And, oh, okay, number 1 is tied. At 32%, Silver Dragon, also at 32%, Crimson Phoenix.
That's so shocking. Okay.
Almost 25% said the Azure Tiger. Oh, we had someone, it looked like someone just changed their answer actually. Silver Dragon is winning by 1 vote now. And then Black Tortoise comes in last at 13%.
That's not surprising at all. But the Crimson Phoenix, I don't know if they haven't read book 2. But that's fun. No, Silver Dragon is definitely the one where I honestly, when I submitted this, I was like, I don't think I would want any of them. They're all kind of like morally gray, but like the least of the evils.
Well, speaking of, you know, book number 2 in the duology, which I have to say your covers are absolutely beautiful.
Thank you. The cover artist did such an amazing job. I'm just like grabbing them from my shelf. This is a UK Illumicrate version, which just arrived in my mail last night. It is beautiful. And then we have the Barnes and Noble purple edition and the standard US edition, which is all beautiful, beautiful pink and purple books.
Congratulations. It's so funny you got that book just last night.
Right, very fortuitous.
So would you like to talk a little bit about your second book in the duology? I know you broke the New York Times bestseller list, which congratulations, that's a huge deal. I remember we had one question that kind of asked, you know, like, did you think when you were writing this duology, would you be here on the New York Best Times list? And having so many readers and followers on your social media channel, what's that like? What's next in your career? And are you going to stay in the fantasy genre?
Oh my gosh, this is so, like, honestly, when I first started, like, I needed a visa to come to the US, and like I didn't know if I could stay. I remember I lived at the dorms near the Union Square in New York, and there was a Barnes and Noble that I would like run to every time after I finished homework and studying. And then I just remember thinking like I just want one book on like a shelf, one somewhere someday. And I remember Googling like, do I need a visa to publish a book in the US? So it's just incredible, honestly, just beyond stunned, that I'm able to do this and share stories from a different part of the world. And I'm super, super looking forward to telling more stories. I love fantasy, and especially Chinese fantasy is what I know and what I'm closest to. So I will definitely be staying in the fantasy genre and in more of the Xianxia and Chinese fantasy veins.
I'm excited to read your next book.
Thank you.
So I know we've gone over about 15 minutes. I did just want to let all of our audience members know that we are recording this. So it will be posted on both our website and our YouTube channel. And we'll also send a follow-up via email with that recording. All right, speed round Q&A. We've had some really awesome questions submitted by our viewers. So I'd love to run through a few of those. All right, did you always know that you wanted to become an author?
I feel like since I was small, I loved telling stories. Like my mom like has photos of me with like little stuffed animals and me telling them stories. So I think I've graduated a little bit from that today. But I've always wanted to, loved writing stories, and I didn't know if I could go into it, especially with my US visa situation. So I actually started off in a totally different field of finance. And then I started writing at night because it feels like to me, like writing just feels like breathing. Like I just love it, and it's just a part of who I am. And so I thought, let me try to get an agent and let me see what happens. And so, yeah, so somehow it worked out. And I'm so fortunate to be here.
Well, we are very fortunate to all have your books to read, and you're getting a ton of love in the chat. I think everyone would agree. And I think what you said, writing is your breathing. I think that's really beautiful and moving. So speaking of writing, what do you do when you're stuck in the middle of writing a story and maybe things aren't really going how you planned?
Yeah, this is really interesting because so I'm in there's like plotter and pantser, where I'm very much a plotter. I'll have like the outline written and I'll have the main plot points, and it's kind of like the steps or the rungs of a ladder for me to climb. When I need to pull myself up, I just look to the next rung. But there are definitely times when even with the next step in sight, I just feel stuck and uninspired. And I think that's a sign for me that something in the book isn't working. I have to tweak it, and I have to make myself, as the author, interested and excited to write about it if I want my readers to be excited about reading it. So it's usually I have to like go from this feeling, this gut feeling, to working out the, why it's not working for me on a technical and storytelling technique standpoint, and then kind of dissect it and kind of reroute myself to get myself interested again.
All right, our next question, what other Chinese mythological or literary stories would you like to see retold for a YA audience?
I love this, and I have one I'm obsessed with. It's not a myth per se. It's a story from a collection, a very famous collection of Chinese ghost stories called Liao Zhai. I'm not sure how to translate it, but it's a ghost story about a flower demon spirit who falls in love with a young scholar, but they can't be together in this life. And so they decide to pass on to the next. And during the reincarnation process, the Lord of the Underworld is so touched by their love story that he says, okay, we're going to reincarnate them to the same place. They're from Hangzhou, which is a very romantic place in China. So the person who does the reincarnation accidentally puts them to the same place, but in different dynasties. And so they know this, they retain the knowledge, and they're like, oh my God, we're in different, like, we're across time. How are we going to get together? So the story is about how they're constantly like trying to find each other throughout time and tracing each other's footsteps, and talking about how like they think they can hear the other person's echoes and smell the other person's perfume on the wind, but it's just not the right time. So I feel like that's something I'm just obsessed with. And I would love to, either read it or tell it someday. But that would be my number one choice.
If you'd ever like to retell it, I'd love to read it. What was an early experience where you learned that language had power? Ooh, I got chills. What a good question.
I know, I love this question. And the number one memory I have was when I first started to learn English. I knew 0 words, and then my parents put me in an all English speaking classroom in China. All my other peers already had a couple years learning, so they knew. And the teacher was speaking in English, and I just remember trying to say something to a classmate, and like I just didn't know how to say it, and I just couldn't communicate with them, and it felt super isolating. And I just remember that moment and like the kind of shame and helplessness I felt. And that was when I realized like language is power, and it's so important. So thankfully no longer there, but that was the first moment I realized as a child, the power of language.
All right. Our next question. So you have both, the northern and southern dialects in this duology. Which dialects are you hearing in your head when you're writing or thinking about it?
I love this. It's very niche, like Chinese culture, but there are like stereotypes about the Northern Chinese versus Southern. How Northern, you're more from like the steppe culture traditionally, and you're more like less refined and just more, I guess, bro-y, for lack of a better word, whereas Southern just feels very like, refined. It's where all the poets were. It's the waters and the rivers and the flowers. So that's kind of like the stereotype. I'm from the North. So I think because I grew up in the North, I mostly hear just Northern dialect for more like Dilaya and Ulara, I imagined as Northern, and their clan is inspired by a Northern residing ethnic minority. But for, I guess, Zen and Lan, I kind of imagined just standard Mandarin. And Hakgong is Cantonese, which is very interesting. But yeah, those are what I imagined.
Second to last question. What music do you listen to while writing your books, especially this duology? And is there a playlist that we can find online?
Yes, there's definitely a playlist. I think it's on my website. I don't know if we can share it with the participants here, but I have a Spotify playlist. I feel like my Spotify at this point is so confused, because me as a person, I'm like very like viral Mando pop, viral K-pop, and just in general pop and happy, bouncy. But my writing playlists are all these like angsty, sad Chinese drama soundtracks. So that's what I listen to when I'm writing. And in particular, I love looking for songs that have lyrics that somehow kind of weave into the story or a certain scene or a character that I'm writing at the time. So a lot of that.
If you want to go ahead and share that link with me afterwards, we can always send it out in the email as well.
Yeah.
Okay, last question. A friend wants to know why the ending for Dark Star Burning Ash Falls White? Do you have more plans to write within the universe?
Oh my gosh, this question. I have so many messages that were like, that ending. And this is going to go into a bit of spoiler territory. So if you haven't read the second book, you might want to cover your ears unless you somehow like spoilers. But I always knew how the Song of the Last Kingdom duology was going to end. I think that it really mirrors what Lan and Zen's journeys kind of represent to each other and to the thematically as well. Excuse me. There's like foreshadowing, I think, when Zen says, you know, you live on for the survivors and you have to carry on the legacy that we fight for, that your parents and ancestors have fought for. And so I think it was really important to show as a theme that, you know, war, there's sacrifice, and there are always those who don't make it. And the second book, Star, is dedicated to those history left behind. So I just remember my grandfathers both fought in wars back when they were young, and they made it, but they have a lot of stories about their fellow soldiers who didn't make it from those wars. And so it's important to preserve their legacy. A lot of history is written by the winners, and I think it's important to remember that there are those whose voices are untold in history. So I think it ends on a note of hope, I think. But there's definitely, you know, it's bittersweet and there are sacrifices.
Thank you for sharing. I see a lot of our librarians are kind of starting to jump off, but they're sharing really wonderful words. Thank you again to everyone who hopped on today. And really, Amelie, thank you so much for dedicating so much time to this webcast, for helping us with our presentation, kind of our talking points, what we really wanted to say. Thank you for your publisher, Penguin Random House, and to your wonderful editor. Also, we want to thank Alyssa from Penguin Random House. She was able to really work with us and, you know, coordinate a lot of time that we were able to meet together. And I saw Alyssa had actually jumped on earlier today. So thanks, Alyssa. Thanks for sharing the book graphics and beautiful photographs with us. And then Amelie, I just have a short note. You know, I think you're a very talented, thoughtful, and creative writer. And I can tell that you really care deeply for your audience that you write for. So thank you for sharing these fantasy collections with our readers, especially when they're at such a pivotal age in life where these stories will always matter. But I think sharing these with the YA audience is really important. Another special thank you I have goes out to all of our audience members from joining all across the world. Like I said, this was a record-breaking webcast, and we were so excited to try a fantasy webcast. It was so fun to talk about and kind of learn, you know, what our librarians are reading in their everyday lives. Thank you for all of our librarians, educators, and lovers of literacy. We couldn't do what we do without you. And, you know, here at JLG, it's our mission to get the best books into the hands of every reader. So having books like Amelia's is really important to us. If anyone has any questions about our books or our categories or kind of how our monthly book box works, you can reach out to us on our website or send us an email. We'd be happy to answer any questions you have. I'm going to hand the mic over to Maria. If she has any last words.
Yeah, I just want to take 2 minutes to express how grateful I am to be able to work with authors like Amelie and the publishers who hold stories like hers in the palms of their hands. And here's where I'm really wishing I had that meme to pull up of the creature kind of seeing the light of day for the first time, emerging from a cave, being like, Mom, Dad, friends. And that's kind of like, I really enjoyed peeking out from behind the scenes for a minute to connect with you, the educators who trust us with the most important task, that is upholding narratives for all kids. And I want to let you know that, as cheesy as this is going to sound, that the editorial team really does care so deeply about what we do. And I can't wait for you to get to know the people who read books all day, every day, so you don't have to, just a little bit better in future webcasts. So I'll turn it over to Amelie now. And thank you for making the last more than an hour your world, and we're just living in it.
I'm so grateful to the junior library team that you guys have put together such an incredible and thoughtful and well coordinated webcast. Hopefully this was, valuable, and just honestly, thank you for putting our books in the hands of, more readers. The School of the White Pines and a lot of the Song of the Last Kingdom deals with books and texts that have been banned or erased from time. So you guys are honestly doing like one of the most important jobs in the world, to you guys and the librarians who are joining these and kind of spreading the word and putting different books into readers' hands. So thank you so much. We as authors wouldn't be here without you guys. And I'm just super grateful. And thank you for sharing the love of stories. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a great weekend.
Bye.
Bye.